Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on, well, quite an extraordinary journey, really. It's born from a courageous quest for understanding. Imagine growing up in an institution, starting at just 6 years old. You're labeled uncontrollable, you miss out completely on a family upbringing, and then decades later you find yourself using cutting-edge tools like AI to finally piece together, why it is the way I am. Hmm. That's a profoundly personal starting point for our exploration today. You've shared with us your journey, listener, from being placed in the Alambia Reception Center to using AI to connect your experiences to concepts like adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and the unseen consequences of institutional care. Your desire to educate others, and perhaps more importantly, to explain your own story. That's precisely the mission of this deep dive.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? How a single, deeply personal story like yours can just illuminate a whole national tragedy. So this deep dive, what we'll do is provide a comprehensive, evidence-based framework. We'll connect the dots, basically, between historical Australian government policy, the specific day-to-day realities of institutional life, and the profound, lifelong psychological impacts on survivors, the people often known as the forgotten Australians.
Exactly. Our mission today is to give you the language, the framework, the understanding you've clearly been searching for.
Yeah.
We want to move beyond just, reciting history. I've been taking a multidisciplinary approach here. We'll explore 5 key theoretical pillars that should help translate those raw lived experiences into, well, structured, actionable insights.
Right. And to connect this to the bigger picture, we'll start by tracing the history of the forgotten Australians through the lens of government inquiries. What did they find? What did they ignore? Then we'll try to quantify the trauma using that public health framework you mentioned, adverse childhood experiences, see how it maps on. We'll delve into John Bowlby's attachment theory. That's crucial for understanding the relational difficulties you and so many other survivors have faced. It really gets to the heart of trust issues.
Okay.
Then we'll explore developmental trauma. That helps unpack the neurological consequences. How does this actually change the brain? And finally, we'll use Irving Goffman's theory of the total institution. It's fascinating stuff looking at how identity was systematically, almost deliberately deconstructed. So by weaving these powerful frameworks together, the aim is to provide a coherent, validating narrative. A narrative of cause and effect, shifting the focus, crucially, from any idea of individual flaw to the undeniable systemic impact.
Okay, let's dive into part 1 then. The system of forgetting policy removal and this idea of the uncontrollable child. So this system, hundreds of thousands of Australian children institutionalized. How did it even start? It didn't just appear out of thin air, surely. We have to look deep into Australia's colonial past for its roots, right?
Absolutely. You really have to go back. The foundations of this system were deeply shaped by, well, British legal traditions, and back then, children were largely viewed as paternal property. They held very few inherent rights of their own. The very first institutions, like the orphan asylum in Sydney, established way back in 1801, were initially set up to manage the children of convicts, particularly those of women who were deemed unfit or simply unable to care for them in those harsh conditions.
Actually, in 1801.
Yeah. And this early model, it set a really powerful, almost unshakable precedent for state intervention. It essentially established the right of the state to step in, remove children, and place them in these environments. And these environments subjected them to compulsory detention, a rigid authoritarian upbringing. It sounds harsh, but the system seemed designed more to assure them a future of, low social rank than to truly nurture them.
And that precedent just cast such a long, dark shadow, didn't it? What started with convict children seems to have rapidly evolved into this broader mechanism of social control. You mentioned monotonous industrial work, an upbringing that was anything but family-like.
Precisely. By the latter half of the 19th century, this whole approach became even more formalized. You had the evangelical child rescue movement imported from Britain, strongly advocating for even greater state intervention. They were driven by a belief, perhaps well-intentioned in their view, that they could save children from moral degradation and poverty.
Like the child savers.
Exactly. And this led directly to legislation across the Australian colonies between 1864 and 1874. These acts empowered the state to remove children deemed at risk of abuse or neglect, very broad terms, and the stated goal, to train them in habits of industry. So this legislative framework, including acts like Queensland's Industrial and Reformatory Schools Act 1865, it became the legal backbone for mass institutionalization that would span the next century. It provided the legal justification for separating families on a scale that would eventually impact, estimates suggest, 500,000 children.
500,000, that's staggering.
Yeah.
So as we move into the 20th century, did the reasons for child removal change? It seems less about convict children by then, maybe more about broader societal issues.
You're right, the focus shifted. Overwhelmingly, the reasons children were removed in the 20th century were deeply linked to societal failures and economic hardship. It wasn't necessarily about a lack of parental love or intent. The landmark 2004 Forgotten Australians report, and other inquiries too, they unequivocally identified poverty and family breakdown as the primary drivers. Just try to picture an era with virtually no government support, no safety nets for families in crisis. Circumstances like a parent's death, a difficult divorce, desertion by a spouse, severe domestic violence, or even the lingering trauma of war. These things frequently led to children being taken into care simply because families felt they had nowhere else to turn.
There were just no other options presented.
Exactly. And single mothers, in particular, faced immense pressure, almost insurmountable economic barriers. They have fewer work opportunities, significantly lower pay compared to men, and absolutely no affordable childcare. So many widowed, deserted, or unmarried women found it simply impossible to support their children independently. They were often coerced, subtly or not so subtly, into relinquishing children. Not because they didn't want to parent, but because of a profound lack of societal infrastructure that would allow them to do so. The system basically offered institutionalization as the only solution.
So children could be made state wards for neglect, which sounds like it could be an incredibly broad term, maybe just covering families struggling with poverty, or as in your own story, listener, for being deemed uncontrollable. That label, uncontrollable, it really seems to highlight a system that was more about dismantling families than supporting them. It's quite a shocking realization when you look past the stated aim of welfare to the actual, often devastating outcome.
It's a very astute observation. That language of welfare and protection used in the legislation often served as a mask, didn't it? It masked a deeply punitive and destructive system underneath. The state's intervention, in so many cases, caused far more damage, far more trauma than the original problem it claimed to solve. It was a deeply flawed societal response to poverty and family instability that just catastrophically overlooked the profound human cost and, the fundamental right of children to grow up within their families, even if those families were struggling.
This brings up a really critical point of intersection, and it's important we touch on it. How does the experience of the Forgotten Australians relate to the stolen generations? There are clear parallels, but also crucial distinctions, aren't there?
Indeed. It's a parallel trauma and sometimes an intersecting one. We know that from the late 19th century right up until the 1970s, tens of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcibly removed under explicit policies of assimilation. Now, these policies were rooted in overtly racist and eugenicist ideologies. The aim was literally to breed out the color by separating children of mixed descent from their families, their communities, their culture, and raising them in white society. It was a deliberate act of cultural destruction.
The Bringing Them Home report.
Yes, the landmark 1997 Bringing Them Home report documented this horrific history. It concluded it was a history of gross violations of human rights and, by the definition in the UN Genocide Convention, it constituted an act of genocide through the forcible transfer of children. The racial motivation was unique and abhorrent.
Right. That racial motivation was absolutely unique to the stolen generations. But the underlying mechanism, the state-sanctioned power to break apart families deemed unfit, that was defined. That was a common thread for both groups, wasn't it? Both policies relied on the state's perceived right to sever those fundamental familial bonds.
That's right. Both groups endured the profound trauma of removal, the shattering loss of family, identity, culture, language, and the harsh, often brutal realities of institutional life. The Bringing Them Home report gave a powerful language to describe this experience. It spoke of grief, loss, trauma, systemic injustice terms that deeply resonate with all survivors of state-sanctioned child removal, regardless of their background. It powerfully highlighted that the suffering caused by these separations was universal, even if the specific motivations differed significantly.
And for decades, the stories of these hundreds of thousands of non-Indigenous children in institutional care, the Forgotten Australians, they were largely unheard. It really was a silent chapter in Australian history. What finally brought this huge scale of neglect and abuse into the public consciousness?
Well, the process was incredibly slow, and it was fraught with government denial, which really underscores that this forgetting wasn't passive. It seems in many ways it was an active political choice to avoid accountability, to avoid looking at the scale of it. It wasn't until the early 2000s that landmark inquiries finally started to bring this to light. In 2003, the Senate Community Affairs References Committee launched a pivotal inquiry, and that culminated in the groundbreaking 2004 report, Forgotten Australians, a report on Australians who experienced institutional or out-of-home care as children. That report was the first time a name and a national platform was given to this estimated 500,000 survivors. It finally shone a much-needed light on this hidden population.
And the findings of that report, they were utterly damning, weren't they? Based on over 600 deeply personal, harrowing testimonies, it found wide-scale, unsafe, improper, and unlawful care of children. It detailed emotional, physical, sexual abuse, criminal assault, neglect, humiliation, deprivation of basic needs like food, education, healthcare. It painted this picture of pervasive depersonalization, names replaced with numbers, family connections deliberately severed, identities suppressed. This clearly wasn't just a few bad apples. It pointed to a systemic failure.
Absolutely. And a central theme, tragically consistent across every single major inquiry since, was the overwhelming absence of love, affection, and nurturing and care. A profound emotional starvation at the most critical developmental stages. This emotional neglect in many ways was just as damaging, if not more insidious sometimes, than the overt physical and sexual abuse. The report made 39 comprehensive recommendations, a blueprint, really, for redress and amelioration, aiming to address the deep wounds left by the system.
But despite how groundbreaking it was, the report was initially met with what survivors understandably felt was just continued neglect. It was tabled just before federal election, got largely brushed aside. It made it hard to get the necessary public and political traction. And the government took 15 months just to respond. And that response was widely condemned as deficient, wasn't it?
Precisely. The government at the time, they rejected or failed to support most of the recommendations, often without giving any real justification. They heavily relied on jurisdictional excuses, basically saying, oh, these issues are a matter for state and territory governments, churches, and agencies. Wow. They effectively abdicated national responsibility for a problem that was clearly national in scope. This just reinforced that feeling among survivors of being continually forgotten, minimized. It truly highlighted that the forgetting was an ongoing political choice, a reluctance to confront the full scale of the state's failures.
But thankfully, after years of sustained, tireless advocacy from incredible survivor groups, like the Care Leavers Australasian Network Clan and the Alliance for Forgotten Australians AFA, the tide finally began to turn. Their persistence, the refusal to be silenced, eventually compelled the government to act.
Yes, their relentless work was absolutely instrumental. On November 16, 2009, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal national apology to the Forgotten Australians and former child migrants in Parliament House. Around 900 survivors actually traveled to Canberra for that moment. It must have been deeply emotional, profoundly validating. It was a crucial step towards acknowledging the truth and the immense pain suffered.
Rudd acknowledged this ugly chapter in our history. He spoke directly to their experience, saying, "We are sorry. Sorry that as children you were taken from your families and placed in institutions where so often you were abused. Sorry for the physical suffering, the emotional starvation, and the cold absence of love, of tenderness, of care." It was a crucial, powerful step. Finally acting on a key recommendation from that 2004 report, providing a much-needed official validation for their suffering.
And the momentum from that apology, combined with continued advocacy, led directly to the establishment of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which ran from 2013 to 2017. Now, while its primary focus was sexual abuse, it inevitably had to cover the broader systemic failures of institutional care, so it reinforced and expanded upon those previous findings. It essentially built on the foundation laid by the Forgotten Australians report, but delved even deeper into the pervasive nature of the abuse across all types of institutions.
The Commission heard from thousands of survivors, examining numerous residential institutions all across the country. Its final report was monumental, 17 volumes, making 409 recommendations. Volumes like Contemporary Out-of-Home Care and Record-Keeping and Information Sharing were particularly relevant to Forgotten Australians. They addressed those systemic issues of poor or destroyed records that consistently blocked survivors trying to seek their own history, trying to find out who they were. This spoke directly to that profound loss of identity and connection that was so central to their experience.
It provided undeniable, high-profile confirmation of the systemic abuse. It made it virtually impossible for governments or the public to look away again. The sheer volume, the meticulous detail of the Royal Commission's findings, it solidified the understanding of this truly dark and shameful chapter in Australian history. It ensured it wouldn't be forgotten again, at least not easily.
Your personal placement listener at the L&B Reception Center in Burwood, Victoria, starting at age 6. It serves as such a profoundly powerful case study for us today. Its history seems to encapsulate the systemic flaws and the lived experience we've been discussing. It provides a microcosm, really, of a larger national system.
That's right. The Victorian government opened Allonby on July 1st, 1961. Its stated purpose was to be a reception, treatment, classification, and transit center. It aimed to alleviate overcrowding at another institution, Tirana Youth Training Center, and supposedly separate and neglected children from juvenile offenders. On paper, it was meant to be short-term, average stay, maybe 2 to 3 months, during which placement decisions would be made. It probably sounded like a progressive solution at the time.
But that benevolent purpose, it seems to diverge sharply from reality almost immediately. Allonby was plagued by the very overcrowding it was meant to solve. By 1970, there was a letter to the Age newspaper warning it was fast becoming a permanent holding place. Capacity swelled from an initial 90 to over 300 children in the mid-70s, far exceeding its official capacity of 228. It became long-term confinement for many, not a transit hub.
And the reality of institutional life there was incredibly stark. The physical environment was consistently described by survivors as pretty drab, dominated by large, impersonal dormitories. Personal testimonies describe a classic institutional existence. Rigid rules, like lining up for absolutely everything, walking on specific sides of staircases, wearing uniforms to the local primary school that instantly marked them as outsiders to the community. The loss of individuality was profound. We've heard accounts like one girl's name being changed simply because another child already had that name. And heartbreakingly, siblings were often separated within the institution and contact between them refused. This just compounded the initial trauma of being removed from their families in the first place. It was an environment systematically designed to strip away individual identity and autonomy.
And beyond just being impersonal, the environment at Allonby was actively unsafe. As early as the late 1960s, reports of neglect and abuse were known to be occurring within its walls. The Royal Commission later heard direct allegations of both physical and sexual abuse at the facility. You mentioned Darlene McKay, a survivor who vividly recounted attempted sexual abuse in an open letter to PM Rudd. Allonby was even mentioned in the Bringing Them Home report as a facility housing Aboriginal children removed from their families, highlighting its tragic intersection with the stolen generations as well.
This brings us to a really critical point about that label, uncontrollable child, which was applied to you, listener, at such a young age. It's absolutely vital to understand that this was not a clinical diagnosis, not in any real sense. Instead, it was a specific legal and administrative catch-all term. Found within child welfare legislation, it was conveniently used to justify making a child a ward of the state and committing them to an institution like Allonby. It was a category of convenience for the system, rather than a reflection of a child's inherent nature or based on any actual clinical assessment.
It's truly eye-opening, isn't it, to realize that research actually shows this term was applied to children for simply complaining about the conditions they were living or working in, by arguing, running away, or breaking things you might expect. This reveals a deeply toxic, almost circular logic at the heart of the system. The very behaviors that would be expected from a traumatized child, reacting normally to a frightening and restrictive environment, were then used as the justification for their continued confinement.
Exactly. Just imagine a child traumatically removed from their family, however struggling that family might have been, and then placed in a frightening, depersonalizing, often abusive environment like Allonby. It's only natural, it's completely understandable, that they would respond with protest, with fear, with anger, or maybe attempts to escape. But these entirely natural human responses were pathologized. They were framed as inherent flaws within the child. And that became the official justification for continued confinement and treatment. So in this light, you weren't institutionalized because you were uncontrollable. You were labeled uncontrollable because you were institutionalized. It completely reframes the experience. It decisively shifts the perceived fault from the child to the system itself, exposing its deeply pathological and self-justifying logic.
So after decades of these damaging effects being known, the philosophy around large institutions finally started to shift in the 1970s and 80s. There was a move towards deinstitutionalization. Allonby's nursery closed in 1986, and the center itself was finally shut down in June 1990. The site, interestingly, is now part of Deakin University, a very different kind of institution. But for the thousands who passed through Allonby, its legacy is one of profound trauma and irrevocably altered lives. The physical institution might be gone, but its impact lives on within those who experienced it. Okay, let's move into part 2. The internal scar is the psychology of an institutionalized childhood. Because the physical walls of Allenby, they were only the visible confinement, weren't they? The true, lasting damage was inflicted internally, on the developing mind, the nervous system. And this is where concepts like adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, become incredibly powerful in helping us understand those unseen scars you described.
Yeah, many listeners will likely be familiar with the ACEs framework. It came out of a landmark public health study, and it basically quantifies the impact of early life trauma. It identifies 10 specific types of traumatic events that can happen before age 18, things like different forms of abuse, neglect, and various types of household dysfunction, like parental separation or substance abuse in the home. What's really crucial here is that research consistently shows a strong dose-response relationship. The more ACEs an individual experiences, the higher their risk for a whole range of negative adult outcomes. Mental illness, substance abuse, chronic physical diseases, social problems. It's a powerful predictor for long-term health and well-being.
Now, while estimates suggest maybe 72% of Australian children experience at least one ACE, the environment of institutional care is fundamentally different, isn't it? It wasn't a place where adverse experiences might happen. It was an environment where they were systemic, they were endemic. It was, as you said earlier, almost like a factory for manufacturing trauma.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. What becomes starkly clear when you look at the evidence is that Australian institutional care wasn't just prone to creating adverse experiences. It was, by its very design, a factory for manufacturing trauma. It hit nearly every single point on the ACC scale, systemically, not accidentally. This is why a childhood spent in an Australian institution was, almost by definition, a childhood with a profoundly high ACE score. Let's quickly break down how the documented experiences map onto those 10 ACE categories. It really illustrates how the system itself was a trauma factory for children like you, listener. Okay, first, physical abuse. The official reports detail sustained brutality. Punishments for tiny offenses were often harsh, cruel, severe physical attacks. Beatings reported by so many survivors. Children were locked in cells or cupboards made to stand for hours. That's ACE number 1.
Okay.
Second, sexual abuse. Tragically, this was widespread. Studies show over 60% of former residents experienced this, from adults and older peers. The Royal Commission heard countless allegations, including specifically at Allenby, like the testimony you mentioned from Darlene McKay. ACE 2.
Gosh.
Third, emotional abuse. Survivors vividly recounted the continual taunting of being told that I was nothing and would amount to nothing. This includes that systematic stripping process of identity we talked about, names changed, referred to by number, a constant assault on their inherent self-worth. ACE 3.
Just constant degradation.
Fourth, physical neglect. Widespread deprivation of food, education, and healthcare. Children were often cold, hungry, received minimal or no medical and dental care. This led to long-term health complications following them into adulthood, compounding their suffering. ACE 4. Fifth, emotional neglect. This was a core, absolutely devastating finding of every major inquiry, consistently described as the cold absence of love, of tenderness, of care, an overwhelming absence of love, affection, and nurturing at the most critical stages of development. Children left emotionally starved, leaving deep, enduring scars. ACE 5.
The absolute core of it, maybe.
Possibly. Sixth, witnessing violence. The institutional environment was rife with violence. Children routinely witnessed the brutal punishment of their peers by staff. They were subjected to high levels of peer-on-peer abuse. One survey found over 77% reported persistent bullying, a constant state of fear and vulnerability. ACE 6. Seventh, household substance abuse. Now, while it wasn't a traditional household, many adult survivors tragically turned to substance abuse later in life to cope with their trauma, sometimes creating generational cycles of addiction. And it's also highly probable, given the poor oversight and lack of training, that some staff members were themselves substance abusers, further contributing to a chaotic and unsafe environment. ACE 7. Eighth, household mental illness. Again, not a typical household, but the staff were often untrained, unsuitable for their roles, poorly supervised. The abusive and neglectful behaviors they perpetrated strongly suggest significant unaddressed mental health issues or personality disorders among some staff. This created a profoundly dysfunctional and pathological household environment for the children, devoid of stability or genuine care. ACE 8. Ninth, parental separation. This was the foundational trauma of the entire system. Forcible, often permanent separation from parents. Access visits were actively discouraged. Successful family reunification rarely happened. Many children placed in care never saw their families again, leading to profound lifelong grief and an unresolved sense of loss. ACE 9.
the starting point for everything else.
Exactly. And 10th, incarcerated household member. The children themselves were, in a very real sense, effectively incarcerated within these institutions, described as virtually imprisoned, stripped of their liberty, and in some cases, children were placed in care precisely because a parent was incarcerated, compounding the trauma of family separation with the added stigma and experience of imprisonment, even by proxy, ACE 10.
Wow. When you map it out like that, it's undeniable. A childhood in an institution basically guaranteed a high ACE score. So connecting this back to you, listener, what does this all mean for the constant ups and downs in the life of limitations and self-destruction you've described? How does this framework help make sense of that?
It means that these struggles, these patterns, they are not character flaws. They're not signs of personal weakness. They are the predictable health and social consequences of a childhood saturated with adversity and trauma. This framework provides a direct scientific link between the experiences within places like Alambi and the difficulties described by survivors. It validates that your experiences are a direct result of systemic trauma, not a personal failing or something inherently wrong with you, and that understanding that reframing is often the very first step towards healing.
So to dig deeper into the relational difficulties, the challenges with trust, intimacy, forming stable bonds that so many survivors face, we need to turn to the foundational work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, what we know as attachment theory. How does this theory illuminate the way those critical early experiences shape our ability to form relationships later in life?
Yeah, Bowlby's attachment theory is incredibly insightful here. It provides a profound explanation for the relational difficulties many survivors grapple with. It highlights how our earliest bonds, or lack thereof, with primary caregivers form what he called an internal working model, essentially, a blueprint for all future relationships. This IWM, it determines our fundamental sense of self-worth, whether we view others as trustworthy, and whether we see the world as basically a safe or dangerous place.
Okay.
A child who experiences consistent, responsive care develops secure attachment. Their IWM says something like, I am worthy of love, others are trustworthy, the world is generally safe. And this becomes the foundation for all healthy future relationships, allowing for healthy intimacy, trust, and interdependence.
Right, that's the ideal.
Mm.
So how did the typical Australian institution like Allenby stack up against the conditions actually needed for secure attachment? It sounds like it would have been almost impossible to create those responsive, consistent conditions within those walls.
It was an environment that was fundamentally hostile to secure attachment. The very conditions necessary for a child to form that secure bond were systematically denied. Just consider these key factors that were endemic in most institutions. First, high staff turnover. You had a constant revolving door of staff and volunteers. This meant no consistent caregiver was available for lasting bonds to form. Children never had the chance to build a stable, predictable relationship with a single caring adult who could act as that secure base Bowlby talked about.
Constant change, constant uncertainty.
Exactly. Second, high child-to-carer ratios. Staff were often responsible for very large groups of children. It was simply impossible, physically impossible, to provide sensitive, individualized one-on-one interactions. Care inevitably became perfunctory, focused purely on managing the group and basic physical needs, rather than emotional connection or individualized attention.
Just crowd control, really.
In many ways, yes. And third, task-oriented care. Care was often explicitly described as business-like, routinized, focused only on the tasks feeding, cleaning, getting kids dressed. Policies sometimes actively discouraged staff from showing affection or forming deep relationships based on this misguided belief it would create unnecessary attachments or favoritism. So this wasn't just neglect. It was sometimes a deliberate prevention of emotional bonding, undermining the very essence of what children need for healthy attachment.
So it wasn't just insecure attachment. You're saying it could be even more profound.
Yes. For many children, this didn't just lead to insecure attachment patterns like anxious or avoidant. It resulted in what the esteemed psychologist Michael Rutter termed privation, the complete failure to form any primary attachment at all. And that's far more profound and damaging than deprivation, which is the loss of an existing bond. Privation is like missing the entire foundational blueprint for human connection and trust from the very start of life. There's nothing to build on.
So, when a child can't form these essential bonds, when that fundamental blueprint is missing or maybe severely distorted, what are the profound, often tragic consequences we see playing out in adulthood? How does this manifest in the lives of survivors like you, listener?
Well, in the absence of secure attachment, children develop maladaptive survival strategies just to cope, just to get their needs met in some minimal way. One well-documented pattern that often emerges from institutional settings is called disinhibited attachment, or sometimes indiscriminate sociability. Children with this pattern often appear overly clingy and attention-seeking. They might show affection to almost any adult, even complete strangers, in a desperate, instinctual attempt to solicit the care and attention they crave, even if it's fleeting or superficial. It's a survival mechanism to get any attention possible in an unresponsive environment.
But that creates such a profoundly tragic paradox for the survivor later on, doesn't it? The very survival strategy that might have helped them get minimal attention inside the institution. This indiscriminate attachment becomes a huge vulnerability and a source of relational failure on the outside. What worked to simply survive within the institution becomes a trap in the real world.
Absolutely. An adult with this pattern might seem overly friendly and trusting at first. They might form intense but often superficial connections very quickly, but this makes them highly susceptible to exploitation and abusive relationships, precisely because they fundamentally lack a healthy template for what safe reciprocal bonds actually look like. They don't know what a healthy boundary feels like or how to establish one. And at the same time, their damaged internal working model, that internal blueprint, means they lack the deep architecture for genuine trust and intimacy. So they might push people away even when they desperately crave closeness because intimacy feels threatening or unsafe.
Right.
The result is often a life marked by the very relational difficulties forgotten Australians consistently describe. A profound fear of abandonment coexisting with difficulty maintaining stable relationships, an inherent inability to truly trust others, a pattern of unstable or failed relationships, and immense challenges with parenting their own children because they never had a model of healthy, secure parenting to draw from. That heartbreaking question from one survivor, how do you know love if you have never been loved? It perfectly articulates a life lived without that essential foundation of secure attachment. Those constant ups and downs you described, listener, are in significant part the chaotic external manifestation of this deep internal void, this missing blueprint.
Okay, so while ACEs quantify the adversity and attachment theory explains the relational damage, the concept of developmental trauma gives us the neurobiological why. It shows us how these chronic early experiences literally get into the skin, shape a person's entire way of being, fundamentally changing the very wiring of the brain.
Yes, and it's really crucial to distinguish developmental trauma, often referred to as complex trauma or CPTSD, from single incident PTSD. PTSD typically results from a single overwhelming event, like a car crash or a natural disaster. Developmental trauma, however, isn't about one event. It's the result of chronic, prolonged, and repeated exposure to interpersonal trauma, like pervasive abuse and neglect experienced during the critical developmental windows of childhood and adolescence. It's an ongoing assault, not an isolated incident, and it has a cumulative, deeply disruptive effect on development.
So it's the chronicity, the repetition during development that's key.
Exactly. When a child grows up in an environment of constant threat, unpredictable danger, chronic neglect, and emotional deprivation like these institutions often were, the trauma isn't just stored as a bad memory. It's experienced as an assault on the child's development over time. This profoundly alters the development of the brain and the nervous system. The young, developing brain, instead of organizing itself around learning, play, exploration, and social connection, fundamentally reorganizes itself around survival. That becomes its primary operating principle. This leads to a chronically activated stress response system. The fight, flight, or freeze response is constantly on a hair trigger, scanning for danger even when no real danger is present. Their internal alarm system gets permanently stuck on high alert, creating a pervasive sense of dread, anxiety, or hypervigilance.
So this neurobiological disorganization, this constant state of high alert, it sounds incredibly pervasive. What does it actually look like in adulthood? How does it align with the lived experience of forgotten Australians, especially those constant ups and downs, and that feeling of a life of limitations and self-destruction that you described, listener?
It manifests in a cluster of interconnected symptoms. It's important to see them not as separate problems, but as different expressions of a single underlying condition rooted in this early trauma. First, and often the core symptom, is emotional dysregulation. This directly corresponds to the constant ups and downs you described. It's the profound inability to manage intense emotions. Survivors often experience chronic irritability, explosive anger that feels out of control, overwhelming anxiety that can feel crippling, and deep wells of sadness or emptiness. And crucially, they lack the ability to self-soothe or return to a calm baseline after distress.
So they get stuck in those intense states.
Exactly. They might adopt maladaptive coping strategies, things like self-harm, substance abuse, risky behaviors, in a desperate attempt to manage these unbearable internal states, desperately trying to find some way to quiet the internal chaos or feel something different. Second, disturbances in self-concept. Those years of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that you are worthless, bad, stupid, or uncontrollable get deeply internalized. This results in a core identity built on profound shame, pervasive guilt, and a feeling of being fundamentally defective or toxic. This powerfully explains the pervasive low self-esteem reported by nearly all survivors, a deeply ingrained belief that something is inherently wrong with them.
It becomes who they think they are.
Precisely. Third, interpersonal difficulties. This is really the behavioral expression of the attachment disruption we just discussed. Survivors may find themselves unconsciously reenacting their childhood dynamics. They might either become abusive or controlling themselves, or repeatedly find themselves drawn into relationships with abusive or neglectful partners, almost as if seeking the familiar, however painful. They may be intensely fearful of abandonment, yet simultaneously push people away when closeness emerges, unable to tolerate the very intimacy they crave because of those deep-seated trust issues and the lack of a healthy relational template. It's a terrible bind. Fourth, maladaptive coping mechanisms. As I touched on, in the face of overwhelming emotional pain and chronic dysregulation, many survivors turn to external methods to cope. This explains the extremely high rates of drug and alcohol addiction, eating disorders, gambling, and other compulsive behaviors within the forgotten Australian community. It's so important to stress these are not signs of moral weakness or poor choices. They are desperate attempts to numb the unbearable pain of an unregulated nervous system, to simply survive the internal storm of chronic hyperarousal and emotional distress.
They're survival strategies, essentially.
Yes, however damaging in the long run. And fifth, physical health problems. The chronic stress of developmental trauma takes a heavy, enduring toll on the physical body. That constant circulation of stress hormones, the prolonged activation of the fight or flight response, it compromises the immune system. It contributes to a wide range of chronic health conditions later in life, things like heart disease, diabetes, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders. This is why many forgotten Australians experience poor physical health outcomes and may require aged care services much earlier than the general population. Their bodies have literally been under siege for decades, accelerating biological wear and tear.
This framework, developmental trauma, it provides such a direct, biological, and profoundly non-judgmental explanation for that feeling of living a life of limitations and self-destruction. It really demonstrates powerfully that these struggles are not a result of personal or moral failure. They are the predictable, physiological, and psychological consequences of a brain and body forced to develop in an environment of unrelenting terror, neglect, and emotional starvation. It powerfully shifts the blame from the individual survivor back to the system that caused the harm. Okay, let's move to our final part, part 3. The institutionalized self-identity, worth, and a life of limitations. So the final piece of this analytical puzzle moves us from the purely psychological to the sociological. We need to understand how the institution itself actively and systematically reshaped a child's very sense of self, their identity. And this is where Erving Goffman's powerful insights from his work on total institutions come into sharp focus.
Yes, Goffman's work is incredibly relevant here. In his seminal 1961 book, Asylums, he introduced this concept of the total institution. He defined it as a place like prisons, military barracks, monasteries, but also, crucially for our deep dive, orphanages and mental hospitals, where a large number of like-situated individuals are cut off from the wider society for an extended period. They lead an enclosed, formally administered life. The defining characteristic of a total institution, in Goffman's view, is its deliberate assault on an inmate's psychological sense of self. It's not accidental, it's part of how the institution functions.
And he argued that upon entering, an individual undergoes what he called mortification of the self, a systematic stripping away of the identity they brought with them from the outside world. This isn't just a side effect you're saying, it's the core mechanism by which these total institutions effectively erase individuality and enforce control, making compliance paramount. How did the stripping process specifically align with those harrowing testimonies of forgotten Australians? How did it attack their identity?
The alignment is chillingly precise. It plays out in several key ways described by Goffman, all echoed in survivor accounts. First, role dispossession. Upon entry, a child is stripped of their previous social roles. They are no longer a son, a daughter, a brother, a student. They immediately become just an inmate or a ward, often just a number in the system. Their entire world narrows dramatically. They're cut off from the normal contacts and relationships that previously defined who they were. Their very social existence gets reduced to the single subordinate role within the institution's hierarchy.
Losing who you were in the world.
Completely. Second, loss of personal possessions. Goffman described the removal of a person's identity kit, their clothing, personal items, even control over their physical appearance. Survivors consistently report their personal belongings being taken away upon entry, replaced by ill-fitting, uniform institutional clothing. This removes those external markers of individuality, making everyone look and feel the same, promoting a collective, depersonalized identity rather than allowing for a unique one.
Makes everyone interchangeable.
Exactly. Third, loss of name and individuality. Perhaps the ultimate act of depersonalization is losing one's name or having it devalued. The practice of referring to children by numbers or even changing their names simply to suit administrative convenience was tragically common in the Australian system, as documented in numerous reports and testimonies. This is a profound assault on one's unique identity. It reduces a person to an interchangeable unit, a mere object within the system's machinery.
Just devastating.
And fourth, loss of self-determination and privacy. Every single aspect of daily life is controlled by a central authority. Waking, eating, working, sleeping, everything is communal and follows a rigid, imposed schedule. There's a complete lack of privacy. Even basic bodily functions are often supervised. This constant surveillance and control removes any sense of personal autonomy. It enforces dependency and helplessness. It effectively teaches children that they have no control over their own lives, their bodies, or their choices.
So, after systematically stripping away the old self, the total institution doesn't just leave a void, it actively builds a new one, you're saying. A specific kind of self.
Yes. It socializes the individual into a new identity. The role of the good patient, or the good inmate, someone Goffman described as becoming dull, harmless, and inconspicuous. Survival inside depends on mastering perfect compliance, suppressing any individuality, learning to navigate the authoritarian structure without drawing negative attention. Goffman calls this process institutionalization. It's a form of training, a conditioning perfectly suited for life inside the institution, but utterly useless, even damaging, outside.
And that leads to the devastating consequence upon release, what can only be understood as a trained incapacity for freedom. For you, listener, spending those years from age 6 to 23, your entire childhood, adolescence, and formative young adulthood, undergoing this intensive conditioning. That's over a decade and a half of being meticulously trained to exist in a specific way, completely at odds with life outside.
Precisely. That's the very period when individuals in a normal environment are learning autonomy, personal choice, nuanced social interactions, self-motivation. They're figuring out how to navigate a complex world, make independent decisions, form their own unique identity. Instead, the institutionalized child masters obedience, the sublimation of personal needs, and constant vigilance of authority skills that are highly rewarded within the institution.
But completely maladaptive outside.
Profoundly maladaptive. When released, these perfected survival skills are not only useless but actively detrimental for a life demanding freedom, self-direction, personal initiative. The self that was so carefully constructed by the institution is utterly ill-equipped for a world that expects independence and individual agency. The life of limitations that survivors consistently describe is a direct outcome of this trained incapacity. Struggling with basic self-determined adult life isn't a sign of personal failure. It's a testament to the institution's dehumanizing training. It is a profound social and psychological injury inflicted by the system itself.
So the ultimate psychological consequence of this whole process of institutionalization, it seems, is a profound and lifelong crisis of identity. We know that building a stable sense of self is a primary developmental task of adolescence. Erickson described it as navigating identity versus identity confusion. It's built on foundations like family history, personal experiences, social relationships. But the institutional experience systematically assaulted every single one of these foundations, leaving this gaping void.
Absolutely. The process of institutionalization, as described by Goffman and tragically echoed in countless survivor testimonies, actively destroyed the very raw materials needed to build a healthy identity. First, and perhaps most fundamentally, the loss of family and history. Forcibly separating children from parents and siblings, actively prohibiting contact, sometimes even lying to children about their parents being dead or having abandoned them, keeping notoriously poor or inaccessible records. All of this severed that vital connection to roots, to history. Many survivors entered adulthood not knowing their parents, unsure if they had siblings, unaware of basic facts about their own birth. They were literally cut off from their past, making it impossible to construct a coherent narrative of who they were and where they came from.
Just to drift.
Completely. Second, the loss of individuality. That stripping process relentlessly erased all the external markers of individuality, name, clothing, personal possessions, everything that helps us build and express a unique sense of self. When everyone looks the same, acts the same, and is treated as interchangeable, that innate human sense of being a distinct, valuable person is deeply undermined. Third, the internalization of a negative identity. Instead of a positive identity built on love, belonging, and affirmation, the institution supplied a negative one. Through constant humiliation, degradation, neglect, and abuse, children were repeatedly told, implicitly and explicitly, that they were nothing, stupid, worthless, bad, uncontrollable. This toxic messaging became the core of their self-concept, built on profound shame and pervasive low self-esteem.
Believing the negative labels.
Yes. And fourth, the alien institutional self. The only identity permitted, the one rewarded within the walls, was that of the compliant inmate, suppressed, watchful, designed purely for institutional survival. When released, this institutionalized identity feels alien and inauthentic outside. It's like wearing a mask that no longer fits or serves any useful purpose in the real world. This leaves a profound void where a true, authentic sense of self should be, making it incredibly difficult to navigate the complexities of adult life, to find purpose, or to simply know, who am I?
Given this systematic destruction of identity, your current quest for understanding, listener, using modern tools like AI to piece together a coherent story, to bridge those gaps in your own history and understanding, it's clearly not just an intellectual exercise. It's a fundamental and deeply courageous part of the healing process for survivors. It's an act of reclaiming your own narrative, finding the pieces of yourself that the system tried so hard to erase.
This raises that important question again. Why is this search for a coherent narrative identity so crucial for healing? It's fundamentally an attempt to answer that profound and painful question. Who am I if everything I was told about myself was a distortion, and my entire history was either erased or hidden from me? This journey to reclaim and reconstruct one's own story, using whatever tools are available, like your use of AI, it's a courageous act of defiance. It's defiance against a system that sought to render its victims nameless and historyless, and to impose a false narrative of inherent defect. It's a powerful step in transforming that personal chaos into meaning, into a story you can finally own.
Okay, let's bring this all together in our outro. So what does this all mean for you, listener, and for countless others who share similar experiences? This deep dive, we hope, has constructed a comprehensive and validating narrative. We've traced a clear, evidence-based line from the historical policies of the state right down to the intimate, lifelong struggles of the individual. We've aimed to show how what you experienced was not random or your fault, but part of a larger, deeply flawed systemic pattern.
That journey you described, from what sounds like a loving family to the institutional confines of Alambi at just 6 years old, under that pretext of being an uncontrollable child, it wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the direct result of a flawed and deeply punitive 20th century Australian child welfare ideology, an ideology that inflicted profound and lasting harm on an estimated 500,000 children. It was, unequivocally, a failure of the state's duty of care on a massive, unforgivable scale.
We've illuminated how that institutional environment was, almost by its very design, a crucible of trauma. We mapped it directly against adverse childhood experiences, showing how it systematically produced a profoundly high ACE score for those who lived within it. We've seen how the lack of consistent, loving caregivers made secure attachment virtually impossible, leading to a damaged internal working model and a lifetime of difficulty with trust in relationships. The very blueprint for healthy human connection was distorted, or, for some, never fully formed.
And we saw how developmental trauma provides the neurobiological explanation for so many of these struggles. A childhood spent in constant fear, chronic stress, leads to a dysregulated nervous system. Those constant ups and downs, the anxiety, the depression, the maladaptive coping mechanisms, they aren't character flaws. They are the understandable, predictable, physiological, and psychological scars of a brain wounded by chronic trauma.
And finally, Irving Goffman's Total Institution showed us how the self was systematically deconstructed. That mortification of the self and the resulting trained incapacity for freedom, leaving survivors with that profound identity crisis. And that label, uncontrollable child, can now be clearly seen for what it was. Not a diagnosis of the child, but a symptom of the institution's own pathological, self-serving logic. A convenient justification for its failures and its inherent brutality.
So the conclusion really is unequivocal. The life of limitations and self-destruction you describe, listener, is not a personal failing. It is the documented, predictable, and scientifically understood consequence of the system you were forced to endure. your courageous journey to understand this past, including your innovative use of modern tools like AI to connect your personal experience with established theory, is a powerful act. It's an act of reclaiming your own story, of transforming chaos into meaning, and truly beginning the hard work of healing.
And in seeking to understand and explain your own story, you and other survivors like you perform such a vital public service. Your testimonies, your resilience, your relentless search for truth, they ensure that this shameful chapter of Australian history isn't just relegated to the forgotten past. You force a continued reckoning with the state's fundamental duty of care. You stand as a powerful living reminder of the profound human cost when that duty is so catastrophically broken. Your strength in pursuing this understanding is truly remarkable.
The path to healing, we know, is long and complex, but it fundamentally begins with understanding and validation, like what we've tried to offer today. For you, listener, or anyone you know who has been affected by institutional or out-of-home care in Australia, please know there are specialized support services and resources available. Organizations like Find and Connect, the Care Leavers Australasia Network, CILAN, and the Alliance for Forgotten Australians, AFA, they provide trauma-informed counseling, crucial help with record tracing, and vital advocacy. Seeking support from professionals who truly understand that this specific, complex trauma is such a crucial step towards healing and reclaiming your life. You don't have to do it alone.
We sincerely hope this deep dive serves as a meaningful step on that path for you, listener, and for anyone else seeking to understand the enduring consequences of a past that shaped and continues to shape a generation. Our final thought for you to take away is this. What insights stand out most powerfully to you from this deep dive? We invite you to reflect on these profound insights as you continue your courageous journey of understanding, explanation, and ultimately healing.